Hi everyone. In a previous video, I talked about an alternative history topic commonly known as Panzer 46. And the idea of Panzer 46 is that the war goes on for a couple more months, maybe a year. The Germans have all of these exciting new armored vehicles on the battlefield. And assuming that Berlin doesn't turn into a radioactive crater in August of 1945, well, what would happen? How would the course of the war actually change? Well, in my previous video, what I showed was that, well, it wouldn't really change at all. Germany, all of these designs that Germany allegedly would have been able to field in 1945 and 46 were either already canceled in very, very early stages of development, or in many cases, just absolute fiction that was never actually entertained by any German engineers. Really, the only thing that Germany would have had by 1946 that was actually new was the Panzer 38D, which was the Hetzer chassis, a light tank destroyer designed in Czechoslovakia, just adopted into production in German factories. Now, the Germany's enemies, on the other hand, had quite a lot to offer that was new. There's a number of armored vehicles that were put into production, and some even in service by 1945. Of course, the Pershing tank, the American M26 medium tank, heavy tank originally, but downgraded to medium by 1946. That tank made it into service. You had them fighting in Europe already, even before they were standardized in March. You had the Soviet Union with the IS-3 in production, the T-44. But the most interesting thing about the T-44 is that its replacement, the T-54, was already undergoing trials and probably would have been in production by the end of the year had the war not ended. And the British, of course, they had the Centurion. This tank was a little late for the actual fighting, but during Operation Century in the summer of 1945, these tanks were very much on, well, what used to be a battlefield once before. So, in terms of long-term influence, it was these tanks that defined the trends in tank building for years and decades to come. Not the Tiger, not the Panther, but the Centurion, the T-54, the IS-3, and the Pershing/Patton. So I decided to make a couple more videos and talk about, how would these tanks have performed in a hypothetical 1945-1946 war with Germany. I'm going to start with a tank that probably made the most noise in the tank building world, the IS-3. This tank was accepted into service and also into production in April of 1945. It was just a tiny bit late to make it to the battlefield in the Second World War, but it was revealed to the Allies in September of 1945, and it made quite a racket. For years after the fact, various former allies and neutral nations would build their own IS-3 killers long after the Soviets themselves were actually, I won't say disillusioned with the tank, but it was taken out of production in 1946, and, well, more powerful, more interesting tanks were being developed. So the IS-3 catches quite a lot of flack for its subpar performance in 1967 during the Six-Day War, but I don't think there's any tank in the world that would perform as intended more than 20 years after it was taken out of production, being used by an army that was so radically different from the Red Army in 1945, and a theater of war that was very different from the theater of war that the Red Army would have been fighting in. It is often also said that, well, if it was taken out of production in 1946 after more than just a little bit over a year of production, it must not have been a very good tank at all. That story is a little bit more complicated than that, so I am going to jump into that discussion in this video. Let's rewind the clock and go back to 1943. In 1943, in January, the Soviets had just encountered the Tiger tank with its powerful 88mm L-56 gun. And then just a few months later, they encountered the Ferdinand with its 88mm L-71 Pak-43. And so Soviet tank designers now see this progression of more and more and more powerful tank guns coming out within the same year. And so, of course, the only answer to a more powerful tank gun is a tank with thicker armor. And that's what the Object 701 was. It was a whole new heavy tank that was designed to combat not just the Tiger and Ferdinand, but also future German tanks, which would no doubt have even more powerful weapons. Development began in 1943, in December of 1943. But as you can imagine, just taking the IS-2 and slapping more armor onto it wasn't an option. The new tank was estimated to weigh 55, 56 tons, and well, a 10-ton increase in weight requires whole new automotive components, new transmission, new suspension. All of this would take time. And the Red Army was getting kind of impatient because they wanted this new tank and they wanted it now. And so another direction of work was started in 1943, what was called modernization of the IS-2. And there were actually two directions. One was the pike hull, pike nose of the IS-2U. That tank was never built. And the other was the bowl-shaped turret of the Kirovets-1. And so the Object 703 tank, later accepted into service as the IS-3, was a combination of these two designs. So at a weight of 46 tons, so just a little bit more than the IS-2, it had, thanks to its sloped armor plates and new bowl-shaped turret, radically increased protection. Since on the inside, this tank was pretty much just an IS-2, but in a different hull with a different turret. The armament was also the same Z25T gun and 12.7mm machine gun. It was really easy to build this tank. The same factories could easily retool to produce it, and 1,705 were ready by the end of the year. Now, this tank's main feature, the armor, catches a lot of flack. Their claim is that, it was not good at all, terrible quality, it would fall apart into pieces when it was hit. Particularly the welding seams, so allegedly, hit it right in the nose and the whole thing opens up like a banana. Well, the Soviets thought of that, and they tested it in their trials, and turns out that, well, no, it doesn't. It can take a direct hit onto a welding seam just fine, and, well, the hull can withstand, an 88mm gun, a 125mm gun, turned out to be quite resistant to frontal attack. The German 88mm gun, the Pak-43, could only penetrate the bottom at a range of under 300 meters, and the upper front plates, it could not even penetrate at 100 meters. So, as you can see, the tank was quite well protected from the front, and there's photos of the IS-3 from the Six-Day War. You can see that it could take quite a bit of damage frontally from much more powerful guns than what Germany would have had in 1945 and still keep on taking. So experiments and experience proves that the armor of the IS-3 was actually quite tough indeed. The other argument I hear against the IS-3 is that it was such a nightmare for the loader that a King Tiger could fire 5 or 6 times in the time it would take the IS-3 to complete one shot. And I mean, the Z25 gun, the 122mm round, was quite big, quite cumbersome. It did have to be loaded in 2 stages, but the difference between the King Tiger and the IS-3, it wasn't actually all that great. The 88mm shell used by the King Tiger, the single-piece ammunition, was quite long, quite heavy, and it was quite awkward to manipulate in the confined space of a King Tiger turret. Remember, just because the turret is big does not actually mean that it has a lot of room in it. There is also, the gun and the ammunition, the other crew members, tons of stuff, and the King Tiger, well, as British ergonomics trials revealed, it was not really laid out all that well. So let's take a look at the numbers. In total, it would take about, on average, 16.5 seconds for the IS-3 to complete a loading cycle. It would take 2.9 seconds, again, on average, to retrieve a shell, 9.5 seconds to retrieve a propellant casing and ram that whole setup into the breech, 3.1 seconds to correct the aim, and then 1 second to fire the gun and wait for it to return to battery. So 16.5 seconds to load. Is that fast? Well, no, not really. But remember that everything has to be compared to something else, and that number doesn't really mean anything in a vacuum. So let's take a look at those British trials that I talked about just now. So the British sequence went open clips, procure round, bend down, and load. Of course, these steps were a little bit different than what the Soviets had, since the ammunition came in one piece instead of two. But the interesting thing is that even while only using the ready racks, the amount of time it would take to carry this out was very different. It could actually range from 6.8 to 12.4 seconds for the first 4 shells in a ready rack, but for the last 4, it averaged out between 11 and 16.7 seconds, so quite a bit of time. Because while the early shells were not super difficult to reach, it became harder and harder to retrieve ammunition as it became depleted. As another interesting note, the British loaders were only using the ready racks, while the IS-3 loaders' time is average for all ready racks, which was the practice in Soviet loading trials. But let's forget about that and move on to another much larger flaw in just comparing these two numbers directly. The British tank does not fire. Remember how the Soviet loading process has to have the gunner load the shell, load the propellant, ram that whole thing in, and then the gunner adjusts his gun, fires the gun, returns to battery. That takes up extra time, which the King Tiger does not do in the trials. All the loader does is open the clips, procure a round, bend down and load. And so to compare apples to apples, we can look at the time it takes for the IS-3 loader just to retrieve his ammunition and put it in the breech. Well, that goes down to a much more manageable 12.4 seconds. Now you'll see that this time is actually quite comparable with loading the King Tiger. For the first 4 rounds in the ready racks, yes, the King Tiger has an advantage. But 12.4 seconds is on the higher side of the first 4 rounds in an ammunition rack, and actually on the low side for the last 4 rounds in the ready racks. So the rate of fire of the King Tiger in ideal conditions would have been faster than the IS-3, but overall was actually fairly comparable. So then the obvious question is, if the IS-3 was such a good tank, why did it only last a year in production? Well, like I said before, the Red Army really wanted the IS-4, and actually they wanted the IS-4 to enter production in the spring of 1945, but that really wasn't an option because the design was just not refined yet. As a result, the IS-4 only entered production in 1946, replacing the IS-3 tank. And the production IS-4 tank, sorry, I only have a fairly small 1/72nd scale model, but this tank, as it tends to happen in development, went from 55 tons to 60, and it had a lot of reliability issues. It was slower than the IS-2. The protection actually wasn't all that much better. But this tank turned out to be entirely unsatisfactory. And since the Soviet army then took a look at what its designers had in store, and you had these 70-ton monsters like the IS-7 and even heavier and heavier tanks on the roadmap, and they made the difficult decision to say, we don't want them. The decision was made to scrap development of absolutely everything that weighed more than 50 tons and return to the concept defined by the IS-3. So if you look at the tank that was eventually accepted into service as the T-10 that came to follow the IS-4, well, this is essentially the concept, then the shape, and the overall layout of the IS-3, just made with a new generation of internal components. In the meantime, the IS-3 tank remained in service with the Soviet Army for decades. It was modernized many times throughout the Cold War, and even though it never saw the kind of combat that it was meant to face in 1945, well, it served with reserve divisions into the 1980s. So as you can see, it was a perfectly serviceable design that would have been very competitive in 1945 against the best the Germans had to throw at it.